Transformation of the mind to the things of Yahweh is a profound journey of renewing perspectives and aligning thoughts with divine truths. It signifies a shift from worldly ideologies to a mindset grounded in spiritual wisdom and understanding. This transformation involves an intentional reshaping of values, priorities, beliefs, allowing the mind to be infused with the profound principles of Yahweh. It's a process of embracing divine perspectives, cultivating discernment, and experience a metamorphosis that transcends the superficial to delve into the depths of spiritual insight and alignment with the will of Yahweh. This is Dr. Ray, and welcome to this week's Hosea International Speaks. Last week, we looked at two examples of transformation, one in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament, that of the life of Jacob and that briefly in the life of Peter. The question now that comes up is, what about my transformation? How do I experience the transformation process? It begins simply right after after salvation. In other words, the salvation process changes the spirit, but then there is the mind, that which directs us each day. With the mind, the transformation begins. Let's read or begin with Ephesians chapter 4, verses 7 through 20. And it says this: "This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk, in the futility," underline that, "in the futility of their mind, having their understanding," two other words, mind and understanding, "darkened, being alienated from the life of Yahweh because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who, being past feeling, have given themselves over to lewdness, to work all uncleanness with greediness, but you have not so learned Christ." The believer is commanded not to walk in the futility of his mind as the Gentiles. That word futility in the Greek is mateos. It means devoid of force, truth, success, and results. It also means useless, of no purpose. Paul broke the mystery of this carnal mind, and he begins to unveil the following. It uncovers in darkness, and there is no light in it. We understand that. Just go ahead and turn off your lights in the room with no light coming in, and there's nothing but pitch darkness. He also unveils it clouds the understanding, confusing and misinterpreting what Yahweh has said or is saying. The life of Yahweh and the life of the Spirit are not allowed to be injected into the life that we, in the Spirit, need, because the Gentile mind is hostile toward the things of Yahweh. You can see that in Romans chapter 8 and verse 7. Also, the carnal mind is ignorant of Yahweh's word and his ways. It is cut off from the flow of the revelation of the Father. You can see that in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 17, in which Jesus had to deal with what Peter was going through. There is also a hardness in the heart when the word of Yahweh is ministered. I don't know if you ever noticed, sometimes when you're sitting there and you might be hearing the word, and all of a sudden there's a jerk in you and you want to drop back and say, no, that's not for me. There's a hardness in there that needs to be broken down. And then there is the unregenerated mind, which feeds the flesh lifestyle and its lust. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 19. The habits formed now through this life of the flesh is contrary to the ways of Christ. The reason for that is there is a duration of time which the mind must go through in order to be renewed. We will talk about that later. Because what has happened is if you haven't received Christ, let's say for 20 or 30 years, you have 20 or 30 years that you must now get out and change it. So the habits formed through this life of the flesh is contrary to the ways of Christ. The mind must be renewed by the proceeding word of Yahweh, the word that tends to come to you. It must be aligned to Yahweh's will and ways. Then it will not be conformed to the ways of this world, but conformed, or what do you want to do? Change to the life of Yahweh. It will not be forced and pressured to think according to the worldly thinking patterns. The mind will then be deprogrammed from the ways of the flesh, reprogrammed according to the Spirit, which will sustain the transformed lifestyle. Now understand this. The mind and its mental attitudes are essential to subduing the habits and practices of the body so that all our actions and reactions are spiritual and wholesome. The mind can reason with the members of our body to bring them into obedience to the stirrings of Yahweh within our hearts. Our body can present itself in the act and the spirit of worship. Let's read scriptures in chapter of Romans, chapter 12, verse 1. It says, I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of Yahweh, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to Yahweh, which is your reasonable service. Let's look at the mind's transformed lifestyle. The life of a person is brought into total transformation with the renewing of the mind. That is, when the mind is renewed, the life is transformed. The mind plays a pivotal role in the permanent change that can happen in a human life. The mind also plays a role when it comes to being deprogrammed or reprogrammed. It is amazing that the mind has the capacity to be reprogrammed. We do not have to live in the same cycle of defeat day after day, week after week, or month after month. We can change our thinking and reinvent ourselves. We can program our future behavior patterns and restructure ourselves for this expression. To do this, we must deprogram our thinking patterns and remove, understand this, limitations and other hindrances that are holding us back from our victory and our success. We can break down these limits and destroy the strongholds that are shutting us out from our full potential and eventual success. Understand this. The mind can overrate itself. The mind can swing to elevate its self-esteem and its self-confidence. It can walk into pride by feeling the self-ego. It can rise in its own strength and put itself, or try to put itself, equal to Yahweh and act on its own God, as its own God. Let's look at Genesis chapter 3, verse 5, which says, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. And notice what the devil said, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Romans 12:3 says it this, for I say, through grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly. Notice that phrase, think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as Yahweh has dealt to each one a measure of faith. The mind can walk in false humility. The mind can react in reverse psychology and operate in false humility just to get attention. It can scheme a way to gain support for itself's agenda. The mind impresses us with what we want to hear so that it can get what it wants for itself. The mind overrates and exaggerates itself, forcing those around us to fall into the temptation of protecting its interests. That is exactly and precisely what the selfish mind wants us to do. The question that comes up is, does the mind have the ability to judge with sound judgment? Understand this, the mind has such a Yahweh-given capacity to act wisely if it is fed with right information and truth. It can act as Yahweh would act when it is renewed and disciplined by the life of the Spirit. The mind will act accurately if it has been harnessed and trained by the disciplines of the Spirit. When the mind has been adjusted and aligned to flow in the revelation and in the inspiration of the Spirit, it can reveal sound judgment and accurate perception. The mind is able to gather convincing proofs of Yahweh's will. Romans chapter 12, verse 2 says it this way, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove," notice this, and you can underline it in your Bible, "that you may prove that is good and acceptable and the perfect will of God." The renewed mind can identify Yahweh's will and come to accurate conclusion of the ways and the workings of Yahweh in the earth. The renewed mind can gather accurate evidence of Yahweh's will. It can decipher Yahweh's pulse and stirrings. It can gather enough evidence to prove the ways of Yahweh. It will bring convincing proof of Yahweh's will and articulate his will for us to follow. This is the mind that will produce conclusive proofs and evidences that Yahweh's will is good and perfect in all its ways. The mind has the ability to produce contents of conversation. The mind produces words and thoughts for contents to be used. Yahweh trains the mind to have thoughts and inspiration so that this faculty will produce the contents for accurate delivery of the conversations. We are to combine spiritual thoughts with spiritual words so that we can speak these messages to others who will experience quick maturity. You can see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 13. Listen, in closing, Yahweh is looking for total transformation and a person who is changed forever. We can see that Paul provides evidence of this true change in the life of the thief that he once had to return. It is not superficial or external exchange or change only. It is to be a deep, significant, internal change that brings glory and honor to Yahweh. Well, if you enjoyed this week's session, just go ahead and hit the like button. And if you want to be notified the next time we go live, go ahead and subscribe. And if you still wish to give, go ahead and use the QR code that is there on your screen. This is Dr. Ray, and I'll see you next week on Hosea International Speaks.